And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who is a member of Los Angeles Birders for supporting Los Angeles Birders. We are an all-volunteer organization. All 100% of your donations and membership fees goes to paying for programs for Los Angeles Birders and paying our bills, and we appreciate that support. For you out there who are not members of LA Birders, please consider joining. We're inexpensive and we do a lot of good for the birding community. We have a wonderful, wonderful library of over 70, in fact, 77 webinars that are recorded on our website for you to use. And please help support that and keep us going. And with that, I'd like to introduce Molly Hill. Molly, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Go ahead, Molly. Thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Los Angeles Birders is very pleased to have Dr. Douglas Robinson with us tonight. Dr. Robinson is an endowed professor of wildlife science and curator of birds at Oregon State University. Doug studies avian ecology and conservation. He focuses on tropical community ecology, influences of environmental change on birds and their life histories, and legacy science via collaborations with citizen scientists. Doug says that birds are his expertise, his vocation, and his avocation. He studies wild birds to understand how and why they respond to environmental change as why they live their lives in the ways they do. Doug also values the skills of both professional and amateur birders alike. Doug believes that birders can make great contributions to the knowledge of birds and the environment while still enjoying birds as a hobby. Doug volunteers as an eBird reviewer, shares all of his bird data with eBird, and encourages others to archive their data as well. Tonight, Doug will discuss the potential for collaborations between professional ornithologists and birders to gather and analyze data, highlighting the vast amount of information available through global bird observation databases, so that the natural history of birds can be documented and we can better understand population trends and predict responses to environmental changes. Please welcome Dr. Doug Robinson.
Thank you, Molly. That was a very nice introduction. I will share my screen here.
The blue screen is up.
Blue screen is up, so I'll give you more than blue to look at. How's that?
Perfect.
All right, let me move a couple of things around here. All right, yeah, really good introduction. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to LA Birders. I have just by accident stumbled across your webinars online and looked at several of them, especially the dowitchers, trying to remind myself how to keep those straight occasionally. And so I appreciate the quality of the webinars and the speakers that you've had. So it's a real privilege to get to share with you tonight. The title of what I'm going to talk about is Grand Challenges in Bird Science, specifically focused on what birders can do. I started thinking about, well, what are the big challenges? And I wrote an essay about it for a new journal. And while I was thinking about what to put in that essay, I thought, well, everybody's in ornithology is like really caught up in building new evolutionary trees. They're caught up in proteomics. They're caught up in all these other technical things that we can now do fairly efficiently, like scanning genomes and that sort of thing. And I thought, you know, what I'm really passionate about is the fundamentals. And I'm particularly passionate about how there seems to be an increasingly large number of people in the public who love birds and have now the ability to contribute what they know about birds, because we have so many online databases. And eBird, of course, is the marquee online database that has kind of revolutionized how we think about birds and birding. And so a lot of what I'm talking about today will involve recommendations on how to make eBird and your birding count the most for addressing some of the big challenges that we have in bird science. And you'll find that a lot of these recommendations may sound kind of familiar. So since a lot of the audience may not know me very well, I'm going to add a little bit about me. Let's see if we can get this to advance here. Yeah, there we go. That maybe Molly didn't talk about. I've been a birder basically my whole life. I found birds when I was 10 years old. I am probably the luckiest guy on the planet because I get to count birds essentially every day. I gave up birding while I was working my way to earn tenure, and it was torturous. I missed the most fun part of my life. And I sadly realized that the day that I got tenure and allowed myself to go back out birding, that my productivity started to go up. And so I should have been birding all along. But anyway, I have a great life because I get to interact with birds every day. I'm your typical birder. I've done big days. My record is 300 species in one day in Panama. I could tell you stories someday about the death march at the end of the day down through a dark tropical forest to try to get from 297 to 300 before it got too dark that day, but we'll save that for another time. As Molly said, I'm at Oregon State University. I've been here for 20 years. I'm the director of our undergrad ornithology program, which is going really well. We have a lot of really keen ornithology students here. We call that program the FLOC, which is an acronym for Field and Lab Ornithology Collaboratory. And so we intentionally focus on helping students get research experience with birds. Curator of birds, like Molly said. Some other things that might be interesting are I have long-term studies in Panama. I started working in Panama in the mid-90s as part of my dissertation work, and I still go back every year to track how the bird community on Barrow, Colorado Island in Gatun Lake, how that's changed. The first surveys were done in the early 1900s by Frank Chapman, and I'm continuing his legacy there. I've also just finished data collection on a decade-long benchmark measurement of the breeding birds of Oregon, where we've counted birds at 11,000 different locations and worked with the birding community to add another 50,000 locations. And so we're working up the data for that. I'm chief editor now, Frontiers in Bird Science. And one of the things I would mention that might be relevant here is that journal has a special section in it called The Science of Birding. And I think that's fairly unique. We basically invite scholars to submit studies or perspective pieces on the interface between science and birding. And so I'm pretty excited about how that's going to turn out. And then the last introductory thing I'll say is that I'm married to a bird artist whose name is Tara Kate. And I mentioned that because she was kind enough to share a lot of her artwork. And so with me for this talk. And so you'll see some of that on the slides. Okay, so let's talk about how birders contribute. Birding is booming, right? It's incredible. If you look at the eBird page, 82 million, right? Complete checklists so far. Almost 1 million eBirders contributing data. It's absolutely incredible. I have no doubt that we will look back on the contributions to birds and ornithology of our generation, and we will say that eBird and the way it blossomed, the way it went through a few growing pains, the way it's contributed to our knowledge of birds, and especially bringing the huge global community of people who love birds together is going to be the greatest contribution to birds of our generation. It's just absolutely incredible. So it gives lots of different kinds of people opportunities to contribute to advancing bird science and solving some of these grand challenges. So I thought I would focus a little bit on talking about what kind of birding is really the most helpful. You know, like if you have limited time and resources, like most of us, what would somebody like me recommend you do in order to make the greatest contribution that you can? And I'm always impressed by the variety of different backgrounds that birders have. This is a picture of one of the events we did for our Oregon benchmark, where we invited people to come out and survey one of the counties in Oregon for a long weekend. And as you can see, you've got artists, attorneys, grad students, delivery people, conservation scientists, like one of the big wigs in Audubon. All kinds of different people love birds and want to help. And so with that in mind, it occurred to me that it might be useful to sort of introduce some thinking about how you would personally decide how you want to help advance bird science. And so I think this largely depends on thinking through things like, what's your particular skill set and your expertise? What interests you in particular? Like, the world of birds is enormous, but we all sort of have a proclivity to find a particular interest in some subset of that giant world associated with birds. So thinking hard about what interests you is really good. And then finally, what are you willing to do to help advance knowledge? So drilling down just a little bit on that, let's talk about skill set and expertise. Are you great at finding and identifying birds? There are lots of birders out there who get their biggest thrill out of chasing down rarities or building county lists or working on a really difficult identification problem. And the listing part, or just the solving an interesting puzzle part, is what really motivates them, and they build their skills and expertise around that. There are other people who just really enjoy being super accurate with their counting. So they know that understanding how bird populations change through time requires reliable information on how many there are. And so they dedicate themselves to doing a good job counting. Other people I find, and all the people I've run into who love birds, really like to find one particular kind of bird, and they follow it around and learn as much as they can about it. I think many people who participate in breeding bird atlases are like this, in the sense that they really enjoy the goal of latching onto a particular bird and figuring out if it's actually nesting in the atlas block. And that motivates them much more than trying to count all the birds that they hear or see around them. Another question is, maybe those things are fun, but you're to the point where your hearing isn't so good anymore, or your mobility is limited, but you really like photography, or you like recording birds. And that's gotten easier and easier through time, much better cameras, much easier access to audio recording on our smartphones, that sort of thing. There are ways that you can make contributions that are really helpful along those lines too. And then with regard to drilling down a bit on what interests you, I think it's helpful to think about what's your motivation about where you want to invest your time. Do you want to be one of these people that wanders everywhere? So you need some sort of goal to justify your wandering widely looking for birds, or do you really enjoy investing in a particular place and trying to decide, or trying to learn as much as you can about the birds in that particular place? Do you find a need or a desire to have the public know about your skills or your expertise? In other words, do you enjoy like seeing your name on eBird associated with your checklists or the top 100 or something like that? Or are you the kind of person who just likes to keep your motivations to yourself? That's also important to think about when you're trying to decide how to make contributions with respect to birds. And then I like the idea of thinking about immediacy versus legacy, and I'll tie this in especially to a small section that I'm going to talk about tonight on benchmarks. Some people like to see their name pop up on eBird right away, and that's their feeling of contribution, which is perfectly fine. And other people are willing to appreciate the fact that something that they see and measure and archive in a database today might not be used for a very long time, decades or even centuries from now. And they really like that idea of, it's almost a sense of immortality, that something that you've seen is preserved. So all that is basically to encourage folks to think, as they're listening to some of the recommendations I'm going to be making, to think deeply about what's motivating you and what are you willing to do to help advance knowledge and solve these grand challenges in bird science. Okay, so what are the 4 things that I'm going to focus on today? First, I'm going to give you an overview of a case study that I've done associated with looking at whether or not we need to improve the quality of certain data that are in eBird. And so I'm going to spend probably about talking about this study that I've done that I think you might find very interesting. Then I'll talk about the benchmarks and how it interacts with our sense of our own personal legacy of how we contribute information about birds, and give you a very quick overview of some very simple key principles if you decide that you like to create a benchmark, or a benchmark is just another word for baseline. Then I'll hit a couple of highlights on photography and audio contributions, particularly focusing on an example of how people are learning a lot about bird diets from photos that are archived in eBird, and on solving the puzzle of how to get tech to tell us correctly what that bird is that's singing outside our window. And then just a little bit about benefactory birding. Some people are at the point where they want to support other people doing good things, but they don't have the time or the energy or whatever to do it themselves. And so I'll make a couple of recommendations about that. Okay, let's talk about eBird and improving the quality of the eBird contributions. One of the, I would say, most controversial aspects of eBird, despite all of the wonderful things that it does for us as birders, is their decision to open their arms, open the doors, let everybody contribute to eBird. People who know a lot about birds and their distributions sometimes get a little grouchy about that decision, even though there are filters running in the background that will catch obvious errors. But I feel like, despite the fact that there are some problems that are associated with that, that the overall gain is great. And I actually had a piece in Birding published, I think it was in the last issue or maybe 2 issues ago, that talked about the rationale for why it's a good reason, or good rationale, to open the doors widely and let everybody contribute information. It's really up to the analysts to decide how to use the data to answer scientific questions. So anyway, we could explore that a little more in the discussion, but right now I want to dive into asking the question specifically, how accurate are the count data that are contributed to eBird? And this is a case study, and the case study is basically a study at one location. And we hope that if it's done well, that it tells us something about what might be going on in other locations. But the accuracy of counting how many individuals of each species are at a place is a really important question, particularly if you want to use the data for addressing conservation issues. You don't want your numbers to be off if you're trying to make decisions about what's common, what's rare, et cetera. And unfortunately, counting birds is a messy business. They don't often cooperate. It's so messy that ornithologists and statisticians have developed lots of sophisticated methods to help estimate how much error there is in bird count data. And the real problem is that most birds are just not available to us when we're observing them. They're either hidden in a bush, they're quiet, they're just around the corner out of sight, what have you. And so we're often not detecting all the species that are present. And then other times, we find lots of birds right out in the open, but then we're terrible at counting how many there are, because it takes a lot of patience and skill to count big numbers of birds. So there's lots of reasons it starts to be really messy. But nobody's quantified how messy that error might be. And so we studied a unique setting and compared a professional's counts of water birds and all the data that were contributed from a particular site and contributed to eBird. Basically compared the eBird data with the professional water bird count data. So I'm going to take you to Oregon, because this is a site that's in my neighborhood. So affectionately, we call it the Philomath Poo Ponds. It's the sewage lagoons. And the lovely people of Philomath contribute on a daily basis a massive amount of nutrients that feed many, many, many water birds and attract all kinds of birds. The site's in the northwest part of Oregon, and it's had so far more than 260 species recorded at it and more than 20,000 eBird checklists. So it's a very popular place for birders to visit. There's 4 ponds. As you can see, 2 long rectangular ones up on the north end and a couple of square-ish ones on the south end. But they're all 35 hectares each. There's a road that runs all around all of the ponds, and so birders are allowed to drive and then stop and look at birds. There, we're lucky. It's a small community, and the Philomath Public Works people allow us to drive in. And when we look at the eBird data, it's apparent that the average time that birders spend there is 60 minutes. And there are no nearby wetlands. So the checklists that are from the Philomath sewage ponds that eBirders are contributing, we're 99.9% sure only contain counts done at the ponds there. Very importantly, with respect to the birds being available to us to count accurately, there are no to very minimal viewing obstructions. Here's a picture of one of the ponds. Mary's Peak in the background is the highest point in the Coast Range. And you can see in the pond here, it's wide open. There's riprap rock all the way around the ponds. There's no vegetation hiding the birds. There's no emergent vegetation anywhere. They're square ponds with ducks on them. And so it's an ideal situation to be able to compare counts contributed by different people to see how the numbers vary. So what we did was we compared the pro observer, me. I was intentionally going to the ponds almost daily sometimes. I admit I had a little bit of an obsession for a while. It's a really fun project. Not many people are addicted to going to sewage ponds, but I'm probably one of not a small number of people on the planet who do. But this is a really productive site, so it's a lot of fun to go to. Anyway, I created what I call the reference counts in the rest of the case study slides that I'll show you here. My intention was to count things very accurately, to get down to plus or minus 1 individuals, but there's a couple of situations where it can't quite be that accurate. Buffleheads are hungry little buggers. They dive constantly, and so my counts are within 5 for those. Shovelers feed in pods. I'll show you a picture of why it's difficult to count those more accurately than plus or minus 10 here in a second. I did error checking against picks and saw that I missed some birds, but the error was low, and I contributed 15,000 checklists for that. And then I compared the reference counts with the eBird counts across an entire decade, so 2010 to 2019, restricted those counts to checklists submitted on the same day that I had done counts, or controlling for any kind of daily or seasonal variation. I focused on 20 different waterbird species, tossed out things like geese that move around a lot that would cause the numbers to be different. So focused on the birds that I expected to be at the ponds for the whole day. And the data came from a very large number of eBirders, 246 and 1,400 checklists from those people. So it's a really big data set and really nice. So you need some context to understand the results I'm going to show you, because if you haven't been there, you might have imaginations about what you think the site looks like and how many birds there are. The context is that on 90% of the days for 90% of the species, the counts are less than 15 birds per pond. So not necessarily a really big number of birds to count. Plenty of species, but it shouldn't on most days be terribly overwhelming. So keep that in mind as you're looking at some of the results. And I'm going to go right from that to a couple of the more common species and show you some information on the graphs about what we had there. So lesser scaup on the left and northern shoveler feeding in these pods. So you can see how it'd be pretty difficult to get an exact count on these feeding pods. They're both common birds. I'm showing you this with the day of the year on the x-axis. So 0 is January the 1st, 200 is here in the summertime, and my reference count. So each dot is a day that I counted birds or counted that particular species and what the count value was. So you can see scaup are gone in the summer, shovelers are mostly gone in the summer. The blue line's the long-term average across the 10 years. And so scaup numbers peak a little over 100 in the spring, basically absent in the summer. Like I said, shovelers are common all the time. It's the most common dabbling duck there. numbers peak about on average around 700 late in the fall, but we get up to a couple thousand. So lots of ducks out there to sort through and look at. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the amount of information that I was using to compare with the eBird checklists. So what did we find? Well, we found that most of the eBird counts were too low. 76% of them were less than the reference value for that particular day. So that means on 3 out of 4 checklists reporting any particular waterbird species, the numbers on the eBird checklist were lower than they should have been, or lower than what was actually there. The median difference, which means half of the count values below that score and half above, the median was 29% too low. But the main take-home point that I want you to keep in mind, that's sort of the theme as we go through the other results here, is really high variability. And so even though half the counts were lower even than 29% too low, and half were closer to the average score that I got, they're super variable. They range all the way from 100% too high, so double what was actually there, to completely missing the species when it was present. So lots of variability. That variability makes it really hard to do analyses on, like, if you wanted to look at trends and numbers through time. Okay, so that's the main result of the count differences, is that they averaged too low by 29%, but they were really variable. What explains those count differences? We're really interested in that. It's like, okay, can we find what is explaining why the numbers are off? Because if we can, then maybe we can help people learn how to do a better job, or we can figure out which species we just shouldn't trust the count data on because there's characteristics of those that are confusing people, or what have you. So we went through a long list of traits, factors associated with the species, like were they dabblers or divers? This might be important because dabblers sit on top of the water all the time and are a lot more visible. Divers are occasionally going under, like buffleheads. So maybe that could account for some of the errors. A lot of birders don't like brown ducks. So maybe the sexual dimorphism contributed to error. You know, you count the male mallards, but not the female mallards because they look too much like gadwalls. Who knows? Birds that form clumps like shovelers might be harder to count. They're doppelgangers. People struggle with scaup. So they look a lot alike. And so that might lead to errors. So we investigated that. We looked at basic things like the time of day, date, how long the birders were there, how many were in their group. We also looked at how many total birds were present that day. So added up all the different numbers of water birds to see if it could be that, like, counting errors were really bad on days where there were just thousands and thousands of birds and people got tired of counting. The peak number of birds is usually in the fall, October and November, and the number is 5,000 to 6,000 total birds. So, you know, it's a reasonable hypothesis to think that people might not count accurately if they get overwhelmed. And then finally, we looked at observer experience. And as our index of that, we looked at the total number of eBird checklists they had submitted. And that's just a rough idea of somebody's experience, right? And we only had that if they had made their eBird profile public, so we could figure that out. But we did have the full on the pond data, so we could use the number of times they had been to the ponds, and so their familiarity or experience at that site might be important. So we looked at that. And then I'll show you some information on this. We looked at an index of their skill, which was the percent of the water bird species that were reported that day that they included on their checklist. So for example, if I had gone out there that day and I saw 20 water bird species and they reported 18, then the score would be 90%. So all that said, I'm going to condense what I'm showing you today quite a bit and just talk about some species level traits that were interesting, and then the observer experience, because that ties directly to some of the recommendations that I'm going to make for you. So we're going to focus on those two things. Before I show you the results, to make sure everybody's on board with how things are going to be presented, I want to walk you quickly through an example of what we do with the data and how we, as we're talking about hundreds or thousands of checklists with bird numbers in it. And so we need a way to present that graphically so that everybody can, including us, can see patterns in the information. So as an example, let's look at coots. Coots are pretty common on the phloem with poo ponds. We start off wanting to know how many coots there are. And so we take the data from eBird, which is a daily count. So each checklist that has coots on it has a number reported. At least those are the ones we used. So people just put an X. We didn't use those checklists. And so you get this long series of count values, and it's hundreds and thousands of them. And so we use those data and we want to see what the distribution of those numbers looks like. And so we can make a histogram first. So even though the numbers are ranging across a big span, we can condense that down into a graph that's based on count values and categories. So we count up how many of those checklists had counts of coots that were between 0 and 100 versus 100 and 200, 200 and 300, et cetera. And this gives us an idea of how the counts are distributed. And in this case, the median count value for coots was 91, which means that half of the time when eBirders counted them, the number of coots was 91 or less, and half the time it was 91 or more. So that's great to know the median, and it's great to know that most of the time there's fewer than 91, right? Half the time there's under that, but the numbers range widely up into much higher values. And so we then use what's called a box plot to condense the information that's in this graph, this histogram, because this still takes up a lot of space, and we can look at the information about how those count values are distributed in an even more condensed way. So we draw this box, this rectangle here, and what's contained within this rectangle is our median value, which is the vertical line in the middle, and then on each side of that vertical line is part of that rectangle. And altogether on both sides, half of the count values are in that box. Almost the rest of the other half is in this part called the whiskers. And the longer these whiskers are, the more those count values stretch out. And then there's a few dots that are like the weird extreme outliers. So like these are the cases where very few counts ever got up to 1,000. So they're basically 5% or less of the count values. So that getting back to the box, when the one side of the box is really long, it means the data are really spread out like you see down here. And if it's really short, it means the data are all clumped together. Okay, I hope that makes a little bit of sense, because I'm going to tell you a couple other things about what you're going to see in our values here. To save a little space, we're going to turn that box plot on its end. And so we're going to see a bunch of box plots for a bunch of different water bird species. And what I want you to focus on when you look at the data from the phloem with poo ponds is whether the box is short or whether the box is tall. Because basically, if the box is small like this one, it means everybody's counting pretty close to around that median or average value. And if it's really tall, that means there's a lot of variation and people are not getting very close to that average value. And so lots of scatter in the count values. So you might have a big range of numbers here, not much of a range in here. And one last thing you'll see on the slide is you'll see numbers at the top of the box plots. These are the sample sizes. This is the number of checklists in days. So you can have more than one checklist submitted on a day. So we call it checklist days. And those are here on the graph just to give you an idea that this is a lot of data. And so we feel pretty confident in our results because there's so much data. Okay, I hope that helped. How did the counts compare? Here's our main result. Count differences were really variable across species. If you look at this graph, you have a box plot for each species. So all the 20 water bird species are down here. Wood duck is here, cinnamon teal is here, northern shoveler here, all the way down to grebes, 2 species of grebes, a coot, and a couple of gulls that were at the ponds a lot. And this on the y-axis is the difference in the count values between the reference counts, which is the blue dashed line here, and the values that were in the eBird checklists for each of these species. So the box plots here are the eBird count data, and the blue dashed line is the reference count data. So for example, on wood duck, the average or the median count difference between my reference count and what eBirders reported was 10 wood ducks. And you can see that the height of that box is pretty small. So not a lot of variation in those counts of wood ducks. So pretty good job counting wood ducks accurately. On the other hand, if you look at shovelers, the median, the bar here is much lower, much closer to 100, but lots of variability in the box plot. So lots of different kinds of counts reported by birders. And this whisker goes way up. So the extreme value, I think, was about 1,000 overcount on wood ducks. So, so the main point is all of these bars, the averages, except for one I'll talk about in a second, are below the reference value. So that fits with our overall finding that counts on average were 29% too low. But most importantly, there's a lot of variation. These box plots are super different in size, right? You got some really tall ones, you got a lot of small ones. So you can't just say, oh, eBird checklist undercount ducks by 30%. Let's just add 30% to everything and we'll be good. It's much more complicated than that. So what about this one? Surf Scoter, the average is exactly on the reference count. So that's fantastic. Why might that be? It could be that in our neck of the woods, surf Scoter is actually celebrity. And so people pay more attention to them. They're like really focused on seeing them. We're inland, we're not on the coast. They're abundant on the coast, but we're 50 miles inland. And when they stop at our little pond, everybody comes to look at them because they're only there for 2 or 3 weeks in the fall. The other aspect that might drive that accuracy is that they're usually present in low numbers. There's only, I think our maximum count is 11. And so that ties into another overall result that I wanted to share with you. And that's that the counting error varied with the number of each species that was present in some interesting ways. The main thing is that if there were less than 30 birds, like with surf scoters, the error was near 0%. So people can handle counting up to about 30 and they do a really, really good job. But once it gets over 30, it starts to get pretty wonky. So averaging 29% error. So that's the species level stuff I wanted to show you. And then I got a little bit on did observer expertise have an influence on counting accuracy? Because you might think that it's quite possible that observers who are better at finding all the species present are also better at counting birds. That's a really good question. Are people who are great at sorting through a big pile of birds and figuring out what all the species there also really good at being accurate counters? Turns out that's not really the case. Here, we've, instead of species on the x-axis, we've got a bunch of different observers that contributed a lot of checklists. So these are the top 10 contributors. And then we got percent error in the checklist instead of just the count difference. And what you'll notice again is that even in the observers who go there a lot and have a lot of experience at that site, their average counts are way under what the blue reference line is. And even though this observer who contributed the most here averages only about 10% off of what was present, there's a huge variation. So it's like some days the counting is accurate and some days it isn't. And so I'll make a recommendation about how we could solve that problem for people who analyze eBird data here in a second. So lots of variability. Some people are consistently really undercounting, and they're always undercounting, like this little small box plots here. Other people are getting a little bit closer some days, but not other days. So what we found was that the counting differences were weakly related to the completeness of the species list. So it does matter, but it's not a perfectly clear relationship. If someone's list of species at the site on that particular day was really low, they tended to overcount how many birds there were. So maybe that's a identification challenge problem that they're facing. If their list had about half of the species that were present, then they tended to undercount the birds by half, so way more than the average. And if they found more than 90% of the species present, then they did tend to be a little bit better on average counting accurately. But again, super highly variable. So that variation causes all kinds of troubles for analysts to try to figure out how to solve that variability and get as much information out of those numbers as they can that they feel confident about. So what do we do about that? First, I think we need to teach observers better about why counting accurately is really helpful and how to count. And as silly as it seems, I really feel like the main way to be good at counting birds is to slow your mind down, to breathe, to focus on this is important. I'm going to take a little time and do this well. Birding, because there's so much stimulation, is often a little bit frenetic, and sometimes also it's very social, and so we forget to try to do a good job counting. And so it can be very simple. There are other things to focus on in terms of like counting flocks accurately and things like that, of course, that are a little bit more structured and technical. But the main thing is to encourage people to slow down and try to do a good job. I talked about the analysts and what we might need them to do. That would be helpful, or what we could do to help them be better at using the best and most accurate count data. And that is to allow eBirders to tag their checklists with our own self-assessment of the accuracy. Lots of time, a lot of us go out birding and we're like, I only have 15 minutes. I'm going to run through and see if anything interesting is there. Yet we still report numbers. It'd be nice to be able to tag our checklist and say, I didn't try very hard today. And then other days we're extremely thorough. So tagging those checklists and saying, I think my counts are very accurate today. That would at least let analysts throw out the data that we ourselves have a lack of confidence in. The third thing there is it would be really great, this is sort of a scientific advancement here, to develop an index of reliable count data. eBird has some really neat analyses where they can categorize an observer's proficiency based on the number of species that they're detecting at a site relative to what's expected at that site on that particular date of the year. And so they can look at different checklists that are contributed and figure out if those are like really good, thorough inventories of a site or not. Nobody has developed a similar kind of index for count data yet. And finally, I think places like like our study at the Philomath poop ponds need to be replicated in other places. So I would love to see other sites, what we could call them marquee sites, where experts are counting and we're like making a dedicated effort to count birds accurately. So you might think that given these findings, I would be a little down on eBird, but I am exactly the opposite. I see the rainbow. I see all the great contributions that eBird is making, and I have invested heavily in it. I'm one of the top contributors of checklists in the entire world. I don't know what my real rank is. Not everybody shows themselves in the top 100, but I'm pretty high up there. So despite knowing the things I know about it, I think it's really an important thing to contribute to if you have the interest and motivation to do so. So I'm going to segue into the next section. The last three things I'm going to hit are a lot shorter. I want to hit some highlights about some thoughts I have. I talked about in the beginning how important it could be to your personal legacy of all your hard-won knowledge about birds. If you were able to shore that legacy up with benchmarks. And benchmarks are basically timestamps about what the bird distributions and abundances look like at our time in history. We're leaving that archived information behind so that other people can gain perspective and understand more about how bird numbers change through time. So benchmarks are essentially just baselines. I decided to call these things benchmarks and turn it into a verb and call it benchmarking, because if you Google baselining, you run into all kinds of weirdness. And so I think benchmarking is a much better word for us to use for this. But the main point I want to make is that all bird numbers and distributions change through time. You'll read things in the media and in popular articles about communities of birds that are associating together that have never associated before. First of all, we don't know that they haven't been associating before because we don't have any earlier benchmarks. And second of all, bird populations and geographic ranges are constantly changing for a large number of reasons. And so we are intrinsically interested in that change. Humans, for some reason, are really good at identifying what we think is changing, and we want to know why. Well, birds are changing all the time. So regardless of the reason that we want to attribute to it, we want to study it. And so creating benchmarks is a great way to help future generations understand how birds have responded to all kinds of change. I'm motivated by people like Grinnell. Of course, in California, you've got the Grinnell Resurvey project that's been completed recently. In Illinois, where I grew up, Stephen Forbes did a similar kind of benchmark in the 1900s. And then I'll show you an example from a professor at the university I went to, Charles Kendi. And then there are lots of long time series archived in this database that's publicly available called BioTime. And I encourage you to take a look at that sometime. It's pretty fantastic. Not just birds, like all kinds of like oceanic organisms have long time series of numbers counted, and butterflies, anything you can think of is in BioTime. From a birder's perspective, it's super fun and useful to create a snapshot in time of what species are present and how many there are of each of those in any particular place. It can be your favorite patch. You can set up a study plot. It can be a trail. It could be a viewpoint where migration is happening. Benchmarks can take all kinds of different forms. What got me interested in benchmarks was Charles Kendi, who was the professor at University of Illinois. He passed away before I got there, but he went to this woodlot, which is 24 hectares, called Trelease Woods in central Illinois. It's mostly corn and soybeans, but a couple of patches of woods were left. And he set up plots, and he walked through that plot and counted the birds every year for 50 years, he and his students. And that forms one of the key benchmarks for knowing how long-term change in bird populations in the Midwest are occurring. And so one of the interesting things he found was that Carolina wrens, which is the dark line on the graph here going through time, they're periodically knocked out by really severe winters, but they always came back. So they go locally extinct and they always recolonize. And then mockingbirds were really rare in the first half of the 20th century. And then they started increasing in the 60s and 70s. And so those kinds of changes are kind of fun to see. The main point I wanted to make that's relevant to some of the key principles I'm going to tell you about is that he did this for 50 years, but he did it based on 2 visits to the plot, to Trelease Woods each year. So that's not a huge time investment. Okay, so you could be formal and do things like I did for my dissertation in Panama and set up a plot and do a bunch of stationary counts every 100 or 200 meters and archive those data in eBird and hope that somebody will find it and repeat it someday. That's fine and very valuable to do it that way, but benchmarking is actually much simpler than that. Here's the key principles that I've got. If you're like, yeah, I do like investing in a place. I do like the idea of creating a legacy of my visit to that particular place. The main thing is that you want to make your visits as precisely repeatable as possible. And the best way to do that is with stationary counts. I was glad to hear about that study of the effects of smoke on birds, that they're using stationary counts, because the main thing that you need to ensure is that whoever wants to repeat your survey someday can go to exactly where you were, stand at that very place on the same day of the year, the same time of day, and count the birds. And then everything else is controlled. A little observer difference, of course, and skill set difference, but otherwise, that's the best way you can control for variation that might cause differences in results. You just want to know, how did the birds change? So if you stand at the one place and do it, you can do that. You can do this with the eBird app by selecting personal locations, or you can do a GPS and enter it into eBird as a stationary count, whatever works the best for you. The main reason we want to do stationary counts is that it maintains the bird habitat linkage. If you think about how most eBirders go about their business, they do traveling counts. So they'll start in one place, they'll count birds, find them, identify them, count them, wander through 6 or 7 or 8 different habitats in the morning, and then submit a checklist. Cannot associate the bird species and numbers with the habitats anymore because that relationship's been lost. We don't know where you were when you saw that bird. So stationary counts are the way to go. The other thing I'll recommend is doing counts that are at least 3 minutes long. eBird recommends 5, but the National Breeding Bird Survey that monitors trends in birds is 3 minutes at each stop. So I think at least 3 minutes is fine. And if you want to track trends and numbers, say in your local community through time, like Kendi doing a couple of visits per year, that's not a big ask. If you can't do that, find a friend who can do a visit and you can do a visit, and that'll add up to 2. But single visits are okay as well. Anything where you're getting that stationary location and being thorough is really helpful. So how do you decide where to go? If you want to do something simple like that, keep it simple, be convenient, stay close to home. The likelihood is if you're counting close to home, nobody else is. You're the one who's responsible for it because that's where you live. And that's really valuable. Even your backyard is a super helpful benchmark measurement of what birds were there at this point in history. You could also, if you like to get away, go to the least impacted places, pick a park, pick a wilderness area. There's surprisingly few benchmark data from wilderness areas. Just walking along the trail and stopping periodically and doing counts is really helpful. You could, if you're into interesting, unique things, go find the rare habitats or situations and survey those. So maybe there's like glades or some unique bog or something like that, isolated patch of desert that's got particularly unique plant community, and you just want to stop in there and do a survey. That's really helpful. Finally, there's this really cool site that's out of Oregon State University called Land Trender. And that is basically a Google map where you can drag a time slider and it'll show you how the landscape is changing over the last 4 or 5 decades. I think it starts in 1984. And that can show you which habitats are changing fast, because maybe you want to know not so much what are the birds like in the more stable places like a wilderness area, but you want to know, like, I want to see change over the next 10 years of my surveying this particular place. A good example of something that changes quickly is the expanding suburban urban fringes as property gets converted and built. Again, get out in front of the expansion and count birds and then see what settle. Ag habitats are a good rapidly changing environment too, as crops change from place to place. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick example of a benchmark that we do here in Corvallis. This is our community project. You know, the National Breeding Bird Survey monitors birds across the country, and it's mostly along roadsides. We wanted to know, if we get off the roadsides, how would the trends that we see compared to the roadside surveys? And so we established, I think it's 14 different hiking routes with about 400 different stops on them. And we walk those every late May and June and count the breeding birds using the same methods that the Breeding Bird Survey uses, except that we don't stop every half mile. Like when you're driving, we stop every 300 meters and do counts. So if you zoom in, you see we start a route here, for example, and walk this whole thing, stop every 300 meters, counting birds. And if you know anything about topographic maps, you can see this is pretty steep. So you also become very fit by the end of the summer if you do these counts. This is a community benchmark. We have 2 visits. One person does volunteers to do a route, and another does it sometime later in the summer. And we'll be able to look at the trends in the bird numbers and really add that to the National Breeding Bird Survey perspective. So, okay, I'm going to save a little bit of time by jumping right over to photography and audio contributions. Like I mentioned in the very beginning, a lot of people don't have the ability to walk around and find places to count birds, or they just love birds, but they don't necessarily have the skill set or the expertise to hear them all and identify them all. But they love to spend time with birds and get to know them. And so photography and recording sounds might be a great option for you. So what can you do that would help advance ornithology? The one example I'll give you for photography comes from an experience I'm having on one of our studies with evening grosbeaks. And that is when the 3 billion birds decline paper came out, one of the offshoots of that was that a program called the Road to Recovery got created, and they picked 5 or maybe 6 species that they were going to focus efforts on to basically say, okay, how do we learn enough about this bird and why it's declined to start to recover it? Evening grosbeak was one of the species picked. It turns out that evening grosbeaks have really interesting biology for a lot of reasons, but one is that they were thought to have their population fluctuations driven by spruce budworms and the massive outbreaks of spruce budworms that happen in their coniferous forest breeding areas. But if you look in the literature, there's very little information that is well supported about what they eat. But then if you go to eBird and you scan through the 50,000 pictures of evening grosbeaks, there are lots of pictures like this, where you can start to say, oh, there's a bird eating some natural food item. What is that? And so one thing that photographers can do that can help us understand basic things about birds is taking pictures of birds doing what they do in nature, eating. And hopefully, if enough good pictures are taken, we can start to work with botanists to like figure out what the bud of this particular species of tree is, and accumulate information that tells us what the birds are eating and how that might be influencing their population changes. Along the audio recording side of things, you all have probably run into Merlin. Merlin is one of several different artificial intelligence schemes that are aiming to identify bird sounds for us when we record them in our phones. I use the Voice Record Pro to make recordings. It's super easy now to flip your smartphone around and turn your recording app on. And one of the things I want to encourage people to do is to try to do that often, because the best way to help the AI learn is to actually load not so great recordings. Because most of the time when we're listening to birds out in the wild and we want some help identifying them correctly, the recordings are not, or the bird song is not perfectly clear. And so Merlin actually needs kind of cruddy recordings loaded into eBird checklists so that it can help the artificial intelligence learn to sort through the noise and figure out what each species sounds like in a variety of different situations. So I encourage you to check out the Voice Record Pro app. And then specifically related to the biology, there are really neat projects going on with finches and recording flight calls. So anytime you find an evening grosbeak, or I know you've got a red crossbill webinar in your archive, so you know about the red crossbill call types. Evening grosbeaks are fun because there's 5 different call types. In California, it's type 2, mostly in the Sierra Nevadas, and type 1 extends down. This map makes it look like this one's here and that one's there, but they're all moving around all the time, and we can't quite figure that out because they all look the same. And so we need voice recordings, and we need to look at the spectrograms that get generated to figure out which type is where at what time of the year, and do they go to the same places in the fall versus the spring? And is type 5 really that range restricted and rare? And if it is, does it need some conservation attention? Those things can only be done by a community-wide effort of birders turning their phones around, pointing them to the sky and getting recordings and then parking them in eBird. Okay, last thing, benefactory birding. Some people are in positions where they're like, I just want to support the new talent out there and the new tech and the new ideas that are available to to us nowadays to help promote the advancement of knowledge. So what are a few other ways to contribute? Well, one of the biggest grand challenges that's probably going to be a big grand challenge for a long time is trying to figure out where migratory birds are going and where do birds die. It's surprising how often we just don't have basic information on birth and death rates on birds. And we don't know where they die. We don't know when they die. But if you've got a tracking device on birds, you can figure out where they're going and when something's ending their life. The first thing that we think of often is bird banding stations that are telling us about where birds are going. But it turns out that the new MODIS towers, which are only running about $10,000 each now, are running laps around banding in terms of the return on investment. So a MODIS tag, or we get about between 100 and 1,000 times more returns on MODIS tags being detected at some other point than where the MODIS tag was put on the bird than we do on a bird band being recovered somewhere besides where it was put on the bird. So in other words, the MODIS tags are 100 to 1,000 times more efficient at giving us information about where birds are going. What's interesting from our perspective in the West is that most of the towers are in the East. See lots of them over here, not so much for us, slowly gaining more and more towers. They're still sparse along the West Coast. Even in Southern California, there's not a ton of them yet. Oregon, we're way behind, slowly adding some. We just got our first one in the Willamette Valley within the last year up here. And it's revealing some really, really interesting stuff. One quick example has to do with Swainson's thrush. Swainson's thrushes were MODIS tagged in BC, and there have been multiple birds that flew south in the fall to Oregon, spent a couple of days here on the coast, and then hung a sharp left and flew all the way across the country to North Carolina before they went to the tropics for the winter. It was pretty unbelievable. So amazing discoveries out there to be had with the MODIS towers. So the towers just sit on your house or in, the Audubon Center or whatever, and they're just listening all the time for a bird with a MODIS tag to come by. They funnel the information back to the MODIS center. So that's one way that you can contribute. Another is supporting banding stations. This is a surprisingly easy thing to do. Most banding stations are run by volunteers, and a lot of people are now collecting feathers, just one tail feather from a bird, and you can genotype it and start to figure out, based on that information, patterns of different populations breeding in different places. Like the Wilson's warblers have 6 different genetically distinctive breeding populations, and you can catch birds on the wintering grounds and figure out how to link them based on their genomes, which is really, really neat. You could Google the project GeneEscape if you haven't heard about it already. Banding stations run by volunteers need support, and so it doesn't cost a lot to make that happen. So, okay, what have we talked about? We talked about improving the quality of eBird contributions and how counting accurately is actually pretty important, and we need more information on that. We need to be really precise with the locations so that we can link the data better to habitat information and learn more about what birds like. We talked about benchmarking and how simple it is to use some precisely repeatable methods, and how rewarding it can be to invest in a place and create a benchmark that somebody else will repeat someday. We talked about photography and audio contributions, and lots of neat things to do with respect to that are pretty easy. And then we talked a little bit about benefactory birding, encouraging people to support MODIS, to support netting stations that are getting feathers for genetic benchmarking. And then the last thing I'll say, it's something that's very rewarding to Tara and me, is that you can support the next gen talent, the next group of young birders and ornithologists coming up, by giving them fellowships or gifts. These don't need to be giant endowments. A lot of times we get in our heads, it's like, oh, I'd need thousands of dollars to invest a scholarship or endow a scholarship. We just see students who are worthy and needy and create our own gift, and not even on an annual basis. We just watch to see who's doing what, and we find out what their needs are. and we'll give them $500. And it is unbelievable how happy that makes them. So I encourage you to pay attention to who's around you and support them as they are young and need support and encouragement. And it's a very rewarding thing to do. So with that, I hope I didn't rush too much, and then I gave you some good ideas, and I'll look forward to having a little discussion if you're interested.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Great.
Uh, it's funny, one of
you so
our
much.
viewers was just commenting that he just read your article in Birding Magazine and he didn't realize you were speaking tonight. So I just want this to be a lesson for every birder out there to join and become involved with Los Angeles birders
Great.
because you
Great.
never know what'll turn up.
Right.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Doug. And for if anybody has questions, there's a Q&A, and please put your questions in the Q&A. And we will go through them. So I see the first question is from Naresh, who says, I find birders very often deliberately report conservative counts. I think it is better to report a count of 40 if they know at least 40 birds are present, even if the actual number is 55. The reasoning is that they are definitely not over-reporting birds in that case, and birders are very hesitant to risk over-reporting birds, sometimes tripping an eBird count filter in the process. This seems to be borne out by the box plots barely extending above the true count. Do you have a recommendation on what is more useful for the database, this lower bound approach, or try to get an accurate count, even if it means occasionally overestimating birds?
Yes, that's a great question. And there's definitely an interaction with the desire not to have to add comments because you've tripped a filter. I run into that myself all the time. So to me, the best move is always to try to be as accurate as you can, because what analysts are hoping is that what you're putting in your checklists is your best representation of what was actually present, not not so much a guess, although there are obviously situations where you have to guess, like swallows. I always struggle with counting flocks of swallows, right? They're swarming around, they're constantly moving. My best strategy is like count 10 and try to figure out what the number within 10 is of, like, are there 6 barn swallows and 3 tree swallows and 1 violet green, or what do we have, and do that multiple times, and then figure out how big the whole flock is, and then apply my proportions to that. That's about the best you can do in situations like that. But I would say, rather than consistently being conservative and counting low, just report what's there. And then if you do have to make comments and it adds a little time to creating your checklist, then hopefully what will happen is that the eBird reviewer will realize that their number is set too low and they need to bump that filter up a little bit and give everybody a break. The real main solution that will happen, besides us trying to count better, is if we can tag our checklists and say, I counted really accurately today, so leave me alone, sort of. Versus I was in a hurry, and so my counts are approximately good, but not necessarily good, versus I wasn't trying to count it all today, but eBird says put some numbers in here, and so that's what I'm doing. Even if we had those 3 tiers of ability to tag our checklist, that would be so helpful to people who want to analyze eBird numbers.
Yeah. No, actually, that's a really good point about how the eBird monitors might simply be unwittingly stifling the number in their counts.
Absolutely. I have experienced the same thing. That's one of the reasons I do stationary counts, is on average, if you do that, you don't stay at one place for a really long time unless it's like a fantastic migration watch site or something. And so your numbers rarely get very big and rarely trip filters. If you do long traveling checklists, then numbers of birds, and so you're more likely to have to add comments.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm encouraging everyone listening to please be accurate in your counts and make a quick comment that really are what, but or so the eBird monitors can adjust their their their
The
their
filters,
The
yeah.
filters. Yeah.
filters.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say that there are so eBird Central has a team of scientists, and they have some very sophisticated methods for figuring out what are reasonable abundance estimates. Like you may have seen the status and trends things that they're
Mhm.
developing. That's some very sophisticated machine learning that they use to start to identify those trends. But if you look closely at those, the the range of values they're using are really big, and in large part that's because there's so much variability in the numbers and uncertainty in the accuracy. And so the more we can do to be as accurate as we care to be at the time, the better those status and trends and estimates of abundance will be. So it's worth the effort. So I encourage people to try hard to count accurately.
Great, thanks.
So
Do you
what do you
know
do
if
about
eBird-
birding by ear? Say you have a tree full of cedar waxwings. What do you do in that situation?
Yeah, do your best. So that it reminds me of our evening grosbeak study on the Corvallis campus. They come here in the spring and they stop over by the thousands, and we often can't see them up in the trees until they fly, and then of course they're swirling around like waxwings. And so if you can't hear them, then the best thing you can do is estimate the number and then make a comment that says there may have been many more. I could only identify 10 individuals that were calling or something like that. I always hope that the flock of things that I hear that I can't see will fly, because then I can at least get a ballpark estimate of there's
Yeah.
50 or there's 100 or something like that. But there's no perfect answer. Counting birds is messy business. We try to do the best we can.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Sometimes I have to put in X for like waxwings and bush tits if I don't see them and I just hear them somewhere.
Yeah,
'Cause,
yeah, exactly. That's a perfectly valid thing to do. Yeah.
And do you know, are there any plans by eBird to allow people to put in error bars for counts?
No, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, just getting the ability to tag the checklists, I think is going to be a hill to climb. It's just that things that we think are simple to implement are actually quite challenging, I hear.
Okay.
It takes
Because
a
I
lot
think
of,
even species wise, it would be nice to be able to have an, I mean, okay, maybe that's hard to implement, but at least I would find it very useful to be able to put in an error bar.
Mhm. You mean
You
like
know,
a range? You mean like there were
yeah,
between
like a
10
range, say,
Yeah.
you know, there are 1,000 plus or minus 200 shovelers,
Mhm. Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That could be really handy. Yeah. I don't know how that, yeah, it's like they added the breeding codes, which give you like little pull down menus, right? Where you can
Right.
select
Right.
all these things. So I wonder at some point how overwhelming it becomes for data entry to have all these options to add all these things. And if they have, I'm not in the meeting rooms about how they decide what they prioritize. I agree that that's really important, but I can imagine that one of the discussions is we're going to confuse the heck out of people with too many pull downs and
Yeah,
options,
yeah.
all
Yeah.
that thing. So
Yeah, but
Definitely
it would be
good.
an option that you don't have to use, but yeah.
yes, yeah, I agree. I would love to have that option.
Yeah, I would,
I try,
yes.
I try to count really accurately every time, but there are definitely many situations where it would be much easier to just say somewhere around 1,000. And here's what I mean by somewhere around.
Right, exactly. We have a question from Lance. I was surprised by the comment that contributing mediocre recordings will help the most with improving Merlin sound ID. I went through a training session for Merlin, and all the examples they showed us were of relatively high quality recordings. I went through the training in 2021. Has it changed since then?
Yeah, I think it has. I think there are plenty of good recordings for most, especially North American birds.
Yeah.
Not the entire vocabulary of every species, but the main things that we would run across. They have lots of really good recordings. And so the challenge, as far as I understand it, for the machine learning is recognizing overlapping sounds as being multiple species and then trying to figure out what those multiple species are. And so when you have multiple bird species singing at the same time, or you have a bird with like a car in the background or somebody talking in the background, it needs have us tell it and train it to say, this is, a red-winged blackbird, and here's what that sound looks like on a spectrogram when all these things are going on in the background. So yeah, I think they're to the point now where they've got so many good recordings archived, and Merlin knows what those things are, that now it's like, I need to do a better job when the background's noisy.
Interesting. Our knee-jerk reaction is a bad photo or a bad recording, and it's in the trash.
Yeah, exactly. I suspect that I might be the world leader on bad recordings and bad photos, because I'm terrible at both of them, but prolific.
Great, thank you. Yvonne asks, do you count males and females in your reference counts? Is there more error in the eBird data when males and female plumage is different than when male and female plumage is the same?
Fantastic question.
Yeah.
No, I was shocked. I was just sure going into the study that sexual dimorphism and the doppelganger issue were going to be important contributors to error, and they had almost no effect. I couldn't believe it. And so, yeah, I don't think it plays much of a role. Now, the one thing that I have not dug into specifically is summertime, when we have lots of molting ducks and males in eclipse plumage and stuff like that. I haven't sorted through that carefully yet. So it's possible in that situation that there might be some persistent problems. But overall, it did not come out as one of the factors that explained the count accuracy issues at all. And I was surprised. I was just sure that was going to be it, and it wasn't.
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Another question from Yvonne. The thrushes that were banded, Swainson's thrushes in British Columbia and counted by Motus in Oregon and then heading to North Carolina, could have they have been swept there somehow by the jet stream, or is this, or do they do this on purpose?
So one hypothesis is that they actually are using the jet stream to get across the country pretty fast. My recollection is that they did those flights in 2 or 3 days. And so, yeah, so they got a tailwind somehow. And I have to double check on this, but my recollection too is that they were olive-backed ones that we didn't realize were actually migrating into Oregon in the fall. So we've got, two major subspecies, russet-backed on the West Coast and olive-backed up in the boreal and subboreal forests. And it was the olive-backs that they caught in BC that came here and then hung a left.
Oh, so they went up on the East Coast and came down on the West and went back? Wow.
Yeah, that's the idea. So yeah, crazy things. Who would ever have guessed that? And we only found it because of Motus tags.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, super cool.
Which raises our next question.
Yeah, our next question is from Calvin, who asks, what's the range on a Motus station?
That's a really good question. So it depends on the topography. Generally, my recollection is that if you're in a really good situation, it's about 7 miles around.
Yeah.
And so if you happen to be like down in a valley, obviously you're not going to hear much outside that valley. If you're up on a hilltop, you'll be able to hear more. They tend to recommend putting them in situations where you have a pretty open view of the landscape, just to enhance the radius. But my recollection of the average is 7 miles. They have a really nice website, and so you could Google Motus, the MOTUS Motus. There's other ways that Motus is spelled for other things in the world, but they have a lot of specs on that. And putting them just about anywhere is useful, because passerines are migrating all over the place, that birds have to be basically Swainson's thrush and bigger right now to carry a MODIS tag. There's lots of shorebirds like Dunlins getting tracked around with MODIS tags, and of course anything bigger than that. So if you're in a coastal area or near a shorebird site, you might get some shorebirds going by, but passerines go everywhere, and so this MODIS towers anywhere are really helpful.
Yeah.
Much more efficient than bird banding in terms of connecting locations where birds are.
Yeah, definitely. Wow.
Great, thank you. Another question from Yvonne. Big difference in eBird data could be due if counters are using a scope versus only binoculars.
Yep.
It would be good if eBird collected optics use, or maybe it does collect optics use?
They do not, and I totally agree. That is a potentially very large factor. Even though our ponds are 35 hectares, that they're still about 300 yards across. And so if somebody's only sitting in their car looking with binoculars and not like saying, I'm going to get out, I'm going to find every bird here, and I'm going to identify and count it with my scope, that totally could be an important explanatory factor. And see how yet another pull down menu or checkbox on our bird checklist would be like, what optics did you use today? Did you use any? Did you use your binoculars? Did you have a scope? That would be super useful. I mean, if I were an analyst and I were like studying I don't know, seabird numbers, I'd want to know if people had a scope, right? So if they're sitting on a migration observation point, I would want to know if they're looking with the scope or not. So that's definitely something that could be improved by allowing us to tell eBird that we've used certain optics. I totally agree.
And then a further drop down, 45, 60.
Yeah, it gets very complicated very quickly.
Oh, it does. Were you wearing your glasses today?
How much sleep did you get last night? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Is this the night to the Rolling Stones concert?
So a question from Lily.
Yeah.
How would you know if a bird that is unlikely in an area that shows up as reported on eBird would be a legitimate report or not?
That is a loaded question.
That's hard.
Yes, that is hard. This is at the crux of what it means to be a bird chaser, right? Because if somebody else finds something rare and you're trying to decide whether you're going to go try to see it yourself, you want as much information as you can get. You want a photo if it's a really rare bird, because you want to know whether it's worth your time and gas money or whatever, driving over there to pursue it. So I would say hard evidence is always the best if you can get it, a photo or a recording. And then the next best thing, sometimes actually better if you know people that found the bird well, is how much you know and trust them. We all rely on that, probably even more than pictures, unless it's a hard ID and you're like, yeah, you're my best friend and you know a lot, but that's a tough one. I need to see your picture. Generally, if we don't know the people, then we really would like to see the hard evidence.
Yeah.
Is that addressing your question there?
I think it might be. If not, then Lily will come back with another question, which she did.
She did. She said yes. Okay, fantastic. Okay. Ken asks, as a regular birder, I may individually count, say, 60 coots on a large body of water, but if I later see coots, say at 200 meters out, I won't count anymore. I try to set a distance limit. Please comment on that scenario.
That also an interesting permutation of what we do not have an ability to tell eBird about, It's very true that, for example, like I do lots of bird surveys based on stationary counts, and in the summertime, I can hear a bush tit up to maybe 40 yards, 50 yards, right at the most, in really good conditions. But I can hear a western meadowlark for 700 or 800 yards.
Yeah.
So there's some things you can do to recognize that in analyses because most analysts would know, yeah, you can hear meadowlarks for a long ways. And so they're sampling a much bigger area when you're counting meadowlarks. But in a case like that, where you're making your own decision about, I'm just not going to count farther away, really our only option is to put in the checklist comments that we restricted our count to a certain radius. And so you might say things like, I was at the refuge and I counted the geese that were on the water, but not the ones that were flying off on the horizon, or something like that. It's good to archive those notes. I don't know, to be honest, how often an analyst would dig through and sort through those notes to figure out whether they should use your information for something they're studying or not. But that's the best solution at present.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, you're giving a solution for a potential problem down the road.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the reasons why I think as we get more and more sophisticated modeling methods, that some of these issues would kind of come out in the wash, because if you're analyzing bird data, you get, like I showed with the coot example, a long list of numbers. And then you don't necessarily have to know a lot more about the situation in which the eBirders contributed those numbers. You just need to know what the distribution of those values looks like. And then you can start to make decisions that say things like, well, I'm going to look at the mean, and then any numbers that are more than 3 standard deviations away from that mean, I'm just throwing those away, because there might be something wrong with those numbers somehow. And the more you stay close to the average values, the more confidence you have in interpreting what those values mean. So I always think it's a good idea to add contextual comments to your checklist comments to help analysts.
Yeah.
But the reality is, when you've got millions and millions of checklists, you can make some big, broad, sweeping decisions and kind of get rid of some of the noise in the data that way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry if that was a little too technical of a
No,
explanation.
No,
that
that's great.
actually
Yeah.
is great. Lance has made a couple of comments on recording tools and the abilities of having a higher quality recording device
Mhm.
than an iPhone or a smartphone and all that. And yeah, that's obviously, or that's very true, should I say?
Yeah, exactly. If you've got that equipment, use it. It's so great. I am really lucky. Within the last, I guess, 2 years, I got a parabolic mic,
Oh,
and I absolutely love it. To be honest, 95% of the time, probably, I'm just listening with it because it's so fun to have these like Superman ears, just stand at a spot. And one of my grad students calls it my cheater device, because I'll turn it on and I'll boost the gain up to about 3, and I'll just be just scanning around. It's amazing how far those things can hear. And of course, if you get a bird that you want to record, it's magnificent compared to an iPhone or any kind of smartphone. So yeah, if you've got it, use it by all means.
yeah.
Mhm.
And we're getting lots of comments about thanking you very much for a wonderful presentation. And I think I'm going to join everyone and thank you for a
Mhm.
wonderful presentation. We really enjoed it.
Yes,
Super.
thank you so much.
Thanks for the privilege of sharing. I really appreciate it. It's very enjoyable.
Well, good. This presentation will be going up on our website, and we're getting more thank yous. Thanks, Carol. And we'll be going up on our website soon. And please join us next month. We have more interesting and exciting webinars coming up. And I think that's about it.
You
Mark, do you
notice
have anything?
Yeah.
I'm
I
sorry.
anticipated your next one by giving you another picture of a tricolored blackbird.
Yeah,
There
that's
you go.
great.
Yes.
A good segue. Yeah.
I know.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Mark, do you have anything to add, or do you have a decent bird joke to finish the
No, neither one at this point.
Okay, with that then, thank you everyone for being with us tonight, and tune in next week. I hope you join us out in the field for a couple of exciting trips. And with that, thank you again, Doug, and we'll see everyone next month.
You're very welcome. Thank you guys.
Yep, thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Thanks
Take care.
again.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.